Hello, very beautiful community. Let's briefly go through together the implications of the sanctions imposed by Trump on Russia. And I've got the Treasury statement here. So let's try to make a little bit of sense of it. So the US has imposed sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. And the idea is to degrade Russia's war chest and bring it about that Trump gets closer to his dream of ending the war. The first thing I should say is that the headlines are better than the real thing. So let's remark on that, and I've got the details in front of me. And so what we're seeing is that there's a 4-week wind down period that gives Russia and its buyers time to adjust. The sanctions are only applying to US persons, not foreign purchasers. And secondary sanctions are not mandated, they're only possible, they're only threatened. So let's just briefly read a little bit. Today's action targets Russia's two large oil companies. Violations of US sanctions may result in the imposition of civil and criminal penalties on US and foreign persons. Secondary sanctions are threatened, not automatic. Foreign financial institutions that conduct or facilitate significant transactions run the risk of being sanctioned. So we've got to understand that this is a significant hit on the Russian economy, but we've also got to understand that it's worth looking at the details here. This does not indicate that Trump is doing some kind of massive anti-Russian turn. Let's talk about this properly. First of all, from Trump's point of view, Trump is in a paradoxical position because on the one hand, he is narcissistically dependent on Putin. He is also ideologically aligned with Putin. He likes the wash of might is right monarchistic ideology that's coming over the globe right now, of which Putin is an extreme example and Trump is a sort of an upstart. Now, I think that at the same time, Trump is enormously constrained by domestic political structure and by European pressure to not just drop Ukraine completely. And there is no contradiction between these things. There's conflict between, there's tension between them, but there's no contradiction. Probably were Trump freer, he'd go more in Putin's direction. But he's constrained, and so he's balancing in a kind of constrained, inevitable way, having to act out being Putin's foe, while also being enormously enamored with Putin and not wanting to be Putin's foe. And Trump thinks that the two things can sort of be brought together. If he ends the war, then he wouldn't be under pressure to be Putin's foe anymore. That's how we balance this. So we just said two things. First of all, look at the details and don't get too overexcited. Secondly, understand how this sits with where Trump is at. So nothing has changed in Trump. He's not changed his views about anything. He's not really changed his approach much to anything. He's continuing balancing the things he was balancing before. Now, he can't change his views really because he has very few views that are settled and those never change. They are sort of corrosively beyond question. He's like a sort of person who needs to use the same spoon for 40 years in a row with his views. He doesn't change them. He's only got about seven or 11 of them. All the rest are fleeting dispositional states that come in March, go in April, come back in May, go again in June. So there's no fundamental change in Trump. There is no fundamental change in Trump's position. But What's this going to do to the Russian economy, and how bad is the Russian economy actually doing? It's very important that this is a question for economic experts, but we can certainly say that on a range of measures, the Russian economy is doing badly, that it's going to be doing worse in 2026, and that the war that Putin is conducting is currently not sustainable for him. But what we also need to notice is that there's a risk on our end of magical thinking about sanctions. Sanctions are corrosive, long distance, radioactive damage to Russia's economy and Russia's capacity to wage the war. They are not any kind of a short term fix. So let's introduce a few minimal correctives here. The war is unsustainable for Putin, but unsustainability is a matter of timing. And so this is always relative. We've got to think of the relative, this is a broken record, been talking about this for ages, the relative strengths of the Russian economy and the Ukrainian economy. It's no good to point out that Russia is losing the war unless you also point out the rate at which Ukraine is winning or losing the war. So you've always got to make relative judgments there. And if you genuinely were serious about that comparison, what you would conclude, if you're keen to not have European security decided by a Russo-Chinese quasi-alliance, what you'd really conclude, if you looked at the relative weakness and strength of the Russian and Ukrainian economy, what you'd really see is an urgent need for greater support for Ukraine, not a reason to giggle at the Russians, because they're doing badly, but they're still probably losing the war more slowly than Ukraine is. Now, Russia is not a democracy. There's a kind of instinctive tendency to wake up frappuccinoing your way through the morning in East London and say, well, if half of the stuff that's happening in Russia happened to us, we'd overthrow our government by voting them out. But Russia isn't a democracy. So what would send your government crashing to a 12% poll rating may not even destabilize the Putin regime. I mean, notice people in Russia are living normal lives when drones are flying around their heads. And they are saying, yeah, the drones are there, but they're also kind of not. And shall we change the subject? Next, there's a kind of magical thinking that we've got to avoid that sort of breaks down in our minds the difference between economic and political fragmentation in Russia. So oftentimes when people make a video and it gets, a 1.5 million views about Russia's economic collapse, what's implied is political collapse, but no mechanism is given for how that's going to happen. In other words, it's no good just to point out what's economically wrong. You have to have an account of how that's actually going to knock the Putin regime or even knock it out of power. So much of our talk about Russia's economic collapse is a kind of political magical thinking. You need to insert a mechanism there that actually explains how this is going to happen. I suppose the last thing I want to say is that you should also not make the mistake that sanctions and the impact downstream on Russian consumers, Russian citizens, is in impoverishing them, going to make them critique Putin. The people who will be led to critique Putin even more for this are the people who already critique Putin privately. The people who are pro-Putin or depoliticized are not necessarily going to be mobilized against Putin. If anything, they'll consolidate against the notion of a West that is assailing them on all sides. So this is not going to be an avenue for us to achieve our geopolitical aims either, while the Russian population rising up. So the way I would put it is 5-1 at the moment. So 5 is how seriously Putin is committed to pursuing the non-independence of Ukraine. What an unbounded piece of nasty work, isn't he? Trying to pursue making a people next door that are trying to be free, making them unfree. But he is extremely committed to that because it is part of his vision of regime security and part of his vision of a kind of reaffirmation of Russia on the global stage and an undermining of the West, or at least of the West conceived as a bunch of democratic societies. Putin is 5x more concerned about that goal than he is concerned about the pressures of an economic kind that he is genuinely talking about, that his Russian economy is genuinely in a multi-dimensional way experiencing. So for economic crisis to tilt Putin to act, what you'd need is a degree of unsustainability of war that puts the two on a par, so it becomes 1-to-1. I'm so worried about continuing the war for economic reasons is a 1, and I have to continue the war because I must achieve ungovernability in Ukraine is also a 1. At the moment, the latter is a 5, and the former is a 1. These sanctions might take the 5 down to a 4.7. Economists can enlighten us more about how best to frame this, but they're certainly not going to take it to a 2 or a 1. And that's to say, still, Putin's commitment to whatever he's trying to do in Ukraine is 5x at least as significant to him as the pressure he feels to begin winding down the war for economic reasons. So that's unfortunately where we are. It's not giggle at Russian economic disintegration time. It's worry about Ukraine being under supported time. That's enough.